He works here. So in fiction, creators often have the tendency to make a counterpart character, perhaps several, to their main character or main cast. For example, here in One Piece, we have Blackbeard, also known as Marshall D. Teach, and his organization, the Blackbeard Pirates, acting as an evil counterpart to Monkey D. Luffy and his Straw Hat Pirates. However, I think there is another organization that is not exactly a evil counterpart to the Straw Hat Pirates, but is a mirror counterpart to the Straw Hat Pirates and Monkey D. Luffy himself. And that organization is the subject of this video today. For moving forward, there will be spoilers for Wano and some for Egghead. So the mirror organization that I believe counterparts with the Straw Hats is the newly formed Cross Guild that we see in the events post Wano. In this video, I will be going over how each character mirrors a member of the Straw Hat Pirates. And then lastly, we'll be going over one character that I think will join Cross Guild in the future and how that character perfectly mirrors a character that's on the Straw Hat crew. With that being said, let's continue. To start things off, let's talk about the two captains of each organization, Monkey D. Luffy and Buggy the Clown. To be fair, I have made a video that talks about how these two compare against one another at length, so please check that out. So we're going to keep things a little simple for this video. So with Buggy the Clown and Monkey D. Luffy, they both have the unique ability of attracting allies to their side. What do I mean by this? So, it has been an ongoing theme in One Piece for Luffy that he can make an ally out of anyone. That's how so many characters, even on his crew, who were once enemies, are now friends. This could be said for Buggy as well, because it's Buggy's animal magnetism, this sort of hidden ability that they both have, that got so many prisoners from Impel Down on his side, and gained him the prestige of being the captain of Cross Guild. Even though one could say that Buggy is the puppet leader of Cross Guild, still in the eyes of the world, he is the captain of Cross Guild. And for whatever reason, probably because of the ability I'm mentioning here, Crocodile and Mihawk went along with having him be the leader to act as the fall guy. So, no matter how funny that may be, it still happened. Whereas in any other situation, knowing the tendencies of Crocodile and Mihawk, they would have killed him on the spot if he didn't have this ability. However, as we know, that didn't happen. Another very interesting thing about Luffy and Buggy is that Luffy was denied being a pirate at a young age because Shanks said he was too young to be on a pirate ship. However, Buggy, funnily enough, spent his entire childhood on the Pirate King's ship. Isn't that interesting? Also, Luffy, in comparison to Buggy, when looking at Goldie Roger, is a very interesting case because Buggy, knowing the man personally, doesn't necessarily see Roger as this mythical hero-like pirate. He probably sees him as a father figure, whereas Luffy, most like the rest of the world, sees Roger as this goal to reach, this person to be like. So in both situations, these are very interesting sides of the same coin. It's also very interesting that Buggy's original bounty and the bounty that he carries throughout the majority of the story is exactly half of what Luffy's first bounty became, which in this case, Buggy's bounty was 15 million, and then Luffy's first bounty was 30 million. It's also very funny now that Buggy's bounty is 189 million berries above Luffy's current bounty, and they're both of the same station at this point in the story, which is Yonko. What's also very interesting is that way back in the day, there are some sketches of what Buggy's crew was originally supposed to be. And in his crew, Zoro was supposed to be there, and I think the idea that was being presented was that, seeing as how Zoro carries a sword in his mouth and Buggy's theme is obviously circus themed, maybe he was supposed to be an allegory on a sword swallower, but he carries a sword in his mouth as part of his fighting style. But as it turns out now, currently, he's upgraded to potentially having Zoro on his crew to actually having Mihawk on his crew. So I find that very fascinating that now Mihawk is essentially his Zoro. That's incredible. But while on the subject of Zoro and Mihawk, let's move on to them. At the start of the Shellstown arc, we are informed by Kobe that Zoro is a very monstrous individual. He's a demon of a man. This is very interesting because despite his bad reputation, for all intents and purposes, he is a good guy. He's a bounty hunter, pirate hunter Zoro. He hunts pirates. Though, then we find out when we meet the man himself that no, Zoro is a very kind, a very human individual, as he saved a little girl named Rika from Apoo's vicious pet wolf, and then later, when rice balls were prepared for him by Rika, only to be stomped on and spat upon by Apoo, he still found it in his heart to eat them because it was food specifically made for him. And then moving forward, Zoro becomes the binding glue and the disciplinarian that holds the entire crew together. Seeing Zoro develop from demon to person is a very interesting development, as Mihawk is treated much in the same way. During the Baratier arc from chapter 50 to 52, Mihawk arrives on the scene, alone, on a raft, lit with candles. Green candles in the anime, which gives the whole vibe a very spooky, otherworldly theme. He slices Don Krieg's galleon in half with ease. At this point in the story, this is simply a unspeakable feat. Nothing before has been this impressive. He challenges Zoro. He sees Zoro as a frog at the bottom of a pond and sees him as a rabbit. But as the fight continues, he starts to respect Zoro as a fellow swordsman, and after defeating him, tasks him with finding him again once he has become stronger. However, at this point, even though we have a good read on Mihawk's code of ethics and how he really does appreciate strength and skill, he is still just a plateau for Zoro to reach, a mountain for Zoro to climb. I really wouldn't call him a character at this point. He's a cool shonen guy. Wouldn't call him a character. However, this changes, and very soon after, as once Luffy beats Arlong and the East Blue is essentially over, Luffy is issued his first bounty. That bounty poster falls in the hands of one Mihawk. Mihawk approaches an island. Shanks and the boys are chilling out on that island. When you see him approach, you know what he does, know he did to Zoro. So this guy means business. We don't have a good scope of what Shanks can do, but we know Shanks is a bad dude. So when he approaches Shanks, oh, a Dragon Ball Z fight of epic proportions is about to break out. Who will win? Who will take on the gold? But no, this does not happen. A party ensues because Mihawk shows Shanks that his young ward has been issued his first big boy bounty by the world government. We see Mihawk drinking beer and having a good time. We see that he's a bit of a stick in the mud, but he's still able to have fun. This right here cements Mihawk as a person, because now we see that he has friends, he has associates, and he's willing to actually put down this strongest swordsman in the world title to sit around and have a drink with people he knows. This continues, but way later, way after Marineford has concluded. But at Marineford, I would like to point out that he will not fight Shanks because that wasn't in his contract to show up at the conflict, which is admirable, might I add. He's not bloodthirsty and always wanting to fight. So he returns to his island, right? And he finds that two squatters have made their home on his island, Zoro and Perona. And we don't get it all here, but we do get some very interesting points when the time skip is ready to pop off. To Mihawk, he sees that Zoro has indeed grown from the last time he met him. Zoro is now not only fighting for his own honor, his own ambitions, but he's fighting for the honor and ambitions of another, Luffy. Mihawk finds this admirable and decides to train him. He's even more impressed that when he comes to him bowing before him, that he's already defeated all the human mandrills outside. So, with that being said, this cements that not only is Mihawk a rival, but he's willing to be a teacher and a father figure, because we see later on, we get a little flashback of Mihawk teaching Zoro that he wouldn't have broken any blade that he's had in the past if he was able to cloak his blades in hockey. And Mihawk challenges him that he cannot drink alcohol until he can turn his blades black appropriately. This, of course, with Zoro being the ever-avid alcoholic or casual drinker, he does this and turns his blades black. He masters arm hockey. So, this puts Mihawk in a light of being, again, a very human character. Even more so when we see his relationship with Perona. They live as roommates, almost like as husband and wife, because they cook together. We see in the cover story where we see all the allies of the Straw Hats from around the world after, I believe, the first big bounty increase is had. We see that Perona, the monkeys, and Mihawk himself are using the kind of decrepit land of Mihawk's island as a cabbage patch. They farm together, and Mihawk is casually hanging out, taking a break from farming while he's reading the paper. This is a very human moment for Mihawk. He now, much like Zoro himself, upon being inundated by these funny little cartoon characters, I'm not calling Zoro a funny cartoon character, it's more so Perona, but these little guys that surround him have sort of softened him and made him more of a character than he was at his introduction. So that's the parallel between the two. Funny little guys soften these biblical monstrous swordsmen up into being, chill dudes. Another interesting mirroring aspect about Zoro and Mihawk are their designs. Zoro is predominantly green, while Mihawk is predominantly red. What's interesting about this is that red and green are complementary colors, and you can find a little bit of each in the other's design. So, for example, pre-time skip Zoro is known for carrying the cursed sword Sandai Kitetsu. Sandai Kitetsu is a katana with a red hilt and a red scabbard. Later in the post-time skip, Zoro's key design contains a red sash that he uses to close his frog's coat. Mihawk, when he uses these big, wide slashing attacks that cause energy slashes to appear, those energy slashes are always green, at least in the anime. So that's very interesting. You find red and green in each one of their designs. Additionally, in terms of cultural inspirations, Zoro has always been very Eastern coded. In the pre-time skip, all of his attacks have some tie back to Buddhism or Hinduism, and then he wears a belly warmer. The belly warmer is called a hamakiri. A hamakiri, in the way that he wears it, is just a cultural thing that you see a lot of middle-aged men in Japan wearing, especially like in TV shows and anime. Also, a hamakiri can be a piece of Japanese armor, which is very interesting because Zoro is portrayed like a samurai in a lot of the aspects of One Piece. In the post-time skip, with Zoro's key design, he wears a frog's coat. This frog's coat looks like a kimono, and he treats it as such because he'll often take his arms out of the sleeve and they'll drape over his waist, similarly to how a samurai would wear his kimono when fighting. Now, with Mihawk, Mihawk is very much like an English cavalier with his hat and his cloak and his boots and etc., etc. Another interesting thing about Mihawk is that besides that, he is very Christianity toned because his crucifix around his neck is a weapon. It's his dagger. And then the Yoru, the famous sword he's known for using, has a hilt that too looks like a crucifix. The island that he occupies has very heavy Christian undertones because there's a giant crucifix in the middle of the island, and he takes residence in a gigantic Catholic cathedral. So you have a meeting of Western undertones meets Eastern undertones in Zoro and Mihawk. Another very interesting aspect that mirrors Zoro and Mihawk are the use of weaponry. I will say they are both equally ridiculous in their use of weapon, as the Yoru, Mihawk's blade, is almost as big as he is, and then of course it is quite unconventional and a little cartoony that Zoro carries a sword in his mouth. However, throughout the course of the story, it is shown that each one of these characters can use their unconventional style of swordsmanship very expertly. As in Mihawk's first appearance, he's able to direct the trajectory of a bullet in an instant with his giant Yoru sword, which is fantastic and phenomenal. And then, of course, we have a bevy of feats of Zoro swordsmanship and using a sword in his mouth, the free sword style. So, with that being said, I also find it very interesting. Mihawk really counts on the power of one, whereas Zoro counts on the power of many. Let me explain. Mihawk's Yoru is his primary weapon. Even though he does technically use multiple weapons, as the crucifix around his neck is a dagger, the serious blade for serious fights is the Yoru. The crucifix dagger is for goofing on those he finds below his notice. Then, with Zoro, all three swords are always on deck. He counts on all three blades to pull off what he needs to do. Now, the style may change because technically he does have 4 styles that he switches between. Yes, 4. The no sword style, the 1 sword style, 2 sword style, 3 sword style. And then, of course, we know the power-up version is a 9 sword style, but that's really more so a transformation-like thing, right? So, in those states, discounting the no sword style, obviously, he counts on all 3 blades to make his fights go in his favor. It is a group effort, which kind of reflects how he has been portrayed through the course of the story, seeing as how he's always been with a group of people, whereas Mihawk has predominantly been alone up until the point that we're speaking about now. So that too is very interesting. But yes, they both have very different methodology when it comes to swordsmanship. What I find very interesting about Zoro and Mihawk in terms of their personalities is that in the story, the only character who seems to care about the title of World's Strongest Swordsman is Zoro. Mihawk, the current title holder, does not care about that or any title. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he never even refers to himself as the world's strongest swordsman. He simply is. Even at his introduction, Zeph introduces him as the world's strongest swordsman. He never refers to himself as that. People just know that he is, which I find very fascinating, because a similar thing happens with Whitebeard. Whitebeard isn't calling himself the world's strongest man. He simply is. Same thing with Kaido. The closest thing with Kaido we got is that he knows that he's not human, but people just recognize him as the world's strongest creature. It's just a matter of fact thing. There's no argument, there's no proving, there's no title card that they place upon themselves that they are this strongest thing. They simply are. Similarly with Vegapunk. Vegapunk is titled as the world's smartest man, but he doesn't call himself the world's smartest man. He's too busy inventing. He simply is, which I find that just fascinating. A matter of fact, he doesn't even see himself as the world's smartest man because he sees anything less than perfection as a failure. So that's interesting. But getting back to Zoro, he's the only one who cares about it, and which I find fascinating. Another thing, Zoro has the aspect that's very similar to Luffy in that he can inspire people in a similar way to how Luffy can make an ally out of anyone. What do I mean by this? Zoro inspires Chopper to be a man when he is drafted by the Foxy Pirates during the Davy Back fight. Also, during his exploits out in the world and gaining such a vast reputation, the kids at his old Kendo dojo are now practicing 3-sword style because of him. He has inspired the next generation to take on a sword style that he made up out of the blue. That's phenomenal. Mihawk, despite being a world-renowned figure and is the world-renowned strongest swordsman, nobody is going out and wielding giant swords in his name. Nobody is. I find that fascinating. No one is trying to copy Mihawk, but everyone is trying to copy Zoro. Fascinating. Fascinating. Another interesting parallel between Zoro and Mihawk is that their nicknames basically indicate what they do in a very odd way, even though they've been a part of the factions that their name indicates that they hunt. So, for example, Zoro is the pirate hunter. He starts off the series as a bounty hunter that hunts pirates, right? He's going after the bounties put on pirates' heads. But he then becomes a pirate, though in a way he's still a pirate hunter as a pirate, because the majority of foes that the Straw Hats go up against are people of enemy pirate factions. So he's still a pirate hunter. He just doesn't collect on the bounties, which is a little lame financially, but that's fine. Okay, now with Mihawk, he was the marine hunter. He was hunting marines. They basically begged him to stop beating them to a pulp, so they made him a warlord so he doesn't have to hunt them anymore. However, with the warlord system being abolished, he joins Cross Guild. Cross Guild is now an organization that specializes in putting bounties on the heads of Marines. So now he's the Marine hunter again. I find that incredibly funny. That's so good. That's so incredible. But yeah, that's how they parallel as well. The pirate hunter still hunts pirates as a pirate. The Marine hunter, once retired from marine hunting as being a part of the Marines, or at least a part of the world government who is also employing the Marines, is now a marine hunter specifically once again, or is at least in a organization that specifically hunts Marines. Incredible. And with that being said, let's move on to our next comparison. Now, when comparing Sanji to Crocodile, some might be perplexed, but narratively, there are quite a few comparisons between the two. The events of the Alabasta saga, especially Alabasta itself, replicate the events of a James Bond movie. Sanji playing the role of James Bond, whereas Crocodile playing the role of a bevy of James Bond villains. One could say Francisco from Man with the Golden Gun, or Ulrich Goldfinger from Goldfinger. Also, funny point on that, Usopp literally paints his finger gold to replicate Crocodile in that arc, so that's just a funny tidbit. But moving on though, and the funny thing about this comparison with Sanji being James Bond and Crocodile being a James Bond villain is that Sanji is the first person of the Straw Hats that makes contact with Crocodile during the Little Garden arc. Sanji finds Mr. Three's wax house and the Den Den Mushi inside and actually communicates with Crocodile. Despite this, neither one ever meets one another. They never meet, which I find fascinating. Another very interesting thing about Sanji and Crocodile in terms of narrative is that Crocodile and Sanji both have a relationship with Ivankov. The twist is that Sanji, for all intents and purposes, seems to really like Ivankov and is endeared by him. However, Crocodile is scared of Ivankov because Ivankov holds the keys to something within Crocodile's past. What this may be, I have an inkling. It's an unoriginal thought, I will say that, but it would kind of play into this James Bond dynamic if, say, Crocodile was formerly a woman, gender changed by the powers of Ivankov's hormone fruit, which would lead to Crocodile actually being one of the other elements that is present in a James Bond movie, the Bond girl. So Crocodile was the Bond villain and his own Bond girl in this James Bond-esque arc in One Piece, which would play very well with Sanji because, of course, Sanji doesn't hit women. And I think, too, a sneaky hint to that being the case might actually come to light because another character that was actually head over heels for Ivankov during the Impel Down arc was Mr. 2. And Mr. 2 famously fought Sanji and used Nami's body as a weapon against Sanji so that he wouldn't hit him. So this could play into Crocodile. Also, another interesting relationship between Crocodile and Mr. 2 is that Crocodile issued that Mr. 2 was the only person to work by himself, which I also find very interesting because there's no real reason for that other than the fact that he could disguise himself as anybody. Another interesting aspect in terms of gender when it comes to Sanji and Crocodile is that if the Crocodile being a woman theory does hold water and does turn out to be true, this would be another correlation to Sanji because both of them would have been women at one point. We see this because in Punk Hazard, we know that Sanji got his soul swapped via law due to the powers of the Apoo fruit and spent a lot of the arc in Nami's body. So that would be another comparison between the two. When comparing Sanji to Crocodile, one thing is clear. These two characters are very well dressed. In most of Sanji's appearances, his key art displays him always wearing a suit. Crocodile, on the other hand, though there was a brief time where he didn't, he is always shown to be wearing a fur coat as a cape of sorts, similar to how the Marines wear their captain's coats. So, the two characters have a degree of opulence surrounding them. Another thing that's very subtle, but I think is very important, is that Crocodile has a mysterious scar across his face. We do not know the origins of said scar, but it's certainly a mystery revolving around his character. This plays in part to Sanji's eye, which was covered for most of the series, but has now since been discovered to be a lineage of his family, as he is a mutant of sorts in being a Germa 66 child. So, both of these characters have facial deformities or facial aspects that lead into their past. We have yet to see what Crocodile's scar actually means, but we are sure to find out in the future. Another interesting fact about Crocodile and Sanji is that they're both avid smokers. One can always see Crocodile smoking a cigar, and Sanji's very fond of smoking cigarettes, and can always be seen with a cigarette in his mouth. This is a very small but very interesting trait between the two characters, because if you don't think about it, it will go unnoticed. When comparing the abilities of Sanji and Crocodile, one might not see too many obvious parallels. However, these are some things that I noticed. Crocodile and Sanji are both immune to heat. Crocodile, thanks to the powers of the sand fruit, is immune to the desert heat of Alabasta, allowing him to wear a fur coat in such extreme conditions. Sanji, on the other hand, has always been immune to heat, even as early as the Baratier arc when he is fighting Pearl. He is the only one who is not damaged by Pearl's flames. Another very interesting ability that Sanji and Crocodile both share is this weird skill of using observation-like abilities. For example, between the three characters, Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji was stated to have the best observation haki. How true that is now, post Wano or going into Egghead, I do not know, because now Luffy has future sight. However, that was the narrative way back when, so we're going to roll with it. Okay, Crocodile has a very similar ability. It's never stated to be haki exactly. It's stated to be something akin to a Devil Fruit only ability, an ability that he trained. His ability is that he can turn to sand upon reflex. This is very unique, as no other Logia has had this exact ability. Anytime a Logia has been very aware of their surroundings and can use their regeneration almost offensively, it's always had something to do with haki. You see this as early as Skypiea during all the fights NL was in. Another very interesting ability that Crocodile and Sanji both share is that being a Logia, Crocodile has a lot of weird movement options, as he can just seemingly disperse and ride on a imaginary wind by turning into sand, whereas Sanji has his own method of moonwalk, a CP9 technique, which he calls Skywalk. This has been modified to move fast in the ocean, and when he is underwater, it is called Blue Walk. Crocodile has some relations with water as well. He, unlike most Delphi users, is extremely weak to water, So much so that a portion of his ability actually turns off when he is wet, and that is the ability to disperse into sand. However, he is also weirdly able to sense waterways under the sand. So that's a very interesting ability of Crocodile's. So with Crocodile and Sanji, they both have this weird relation to heat and water, and they both are extremely aware of their surroundings, making them to be great foils in terms of pairing cross-guild to the members of the Straw Hat Pirates. So in terms of how these two characters are seen by the One Piece world, and this could be a bit of speculation on my part, but I think Crocodile's going to have something very interesting happen to him. So, do you remember how Sanji's whole bounty fiasco came about? When he was issued his bounty for the first time, he got a drawn bounty poster, not a actual good photo like the rest of the Straw Hats, right? Which led into a whole myriad of plot points. Duval, and then the whole thing with Whole Cake and yada yada yada, right? I think with Crocodile coming into the scene with such a high bounty, he most likely is going to have a situation happen in which he experiences a bounty reset, or people will think he's actually dead. Because if I'm right and he actually is a woman, and he gets turned back into a woman under some sort of circumstance, no one's going to know that this woman and Crocodile are the same person. Therefore, his bounty would effectively be nothing, which would be very funny and very heartbreaking, which I think would put him towards being in a downward spiral of being a comedic character, much like how Sanji has become. A mixture of being a very cool and suave debonair character, but not one that is above being used for comic relief, which it really makes for a very well-rounded character in One Piece. A bit of cool, but a bit of silly. So I think that's what's going to happen to Crocodile. He is going to experience a bounty reset, and everyone's going to wonder what happened to Crocodile and who is this woman tagging around with Buggy and Mihawk. I think that's actually going to be the case. When comparing Usopp to Mr. 3, one might think there's not a lot to go on, but I think there actually is. They are very close to their respective captains, Luffy being close to Usopp, and Buggy being close to Mr. 3. However, with Luffy and Usopp, I think it's more of a adolescent boyhood friendship relationship, whereas with Buggy and Mr. 3, it's more of like an adult co-worker relationship. They are blood brothers, but when an opportunity arises, Mr. 3 will throw Buggy under the bus. And we see this when Cross Guild is formed and Crocodile comes onto the scene. Mr. 3 immediately goes into Baroque Works agent mode and starts kissing up to Crocodile in order to gain his favor, which I find very funny. So that's sort of the mirror of things. You have a adolescent relationship with Luffy and Usopp, but then you have a more adult co-worker, I'll stab you in the back when the opportunity finds me relationship with Mr. 3 and Buggy. Another interesting aspect about Mr. 3, also known as Galdino, and Usopp is that the number 3 is very prominent with both of them, mostly in their positions in their respective organizations. So, Usopp is the third Straw Hat to join the Straw Hat Pirates, if you don't count Luffy as being first. So it would go Luffy as 0, Zoro as 1, Nami as 2, Usopp as 3. Galdino, also known as Mr. 3, is the third highest ranked member in the Baroque Works organization. Additionally, he is the third boss character to be associated with Buggy, if you count Buggy in this situation. So, if you say Buggy, the boss of the Orange Town arc, then you say Alvida, and then you say Mr. 3, because all three of these characters were bosses in their respective arcs. Alvida at the Romance Dawn arc, I believe it's called, then Buggy in Orange Town, and then you have Mr. 3, whom got his own arc in the form of Little Garden, where he was the major threat at. Another parallel between Usopp and Mr. 3 are their use of tricks and traps. Usopp in the pre and post time skip uses a variety of tricks and traps to get the better of his opponent. In the pre-time skip, I would say his most prominent trick is his 5-ton hammer, which then is upgraded to the 10-ton hammer against Perona. His most popular traps in the post-time skip usually are all pop related. In Little Garden, Mr. 3 had a load of traps that he used to trap Luffy, Dory, Buggy, and Vivi, Zoro, and Nami. He used tricks in the form of wax statues to act as decoys when running away from Luffy. Another very interesting parallel between Usopp and Mr. 3 is that they are both artists. Mr. 3 is adept at sculpture, whereas Usopp is adept at sculpture and painting. We see Usopp's sculpture skills. I believe when entering or leaving Drum, he makes a snow sculpture of Kaya. Another thing that unites Usopp and Mr. 3 is ingenuity and the ability to survive deathly events. So, in a variety of times in the story, Mr. 3's wax abilities have come in handy in crafting makeshift items that have proved very useful for the event and time that he is in. For example, he was able to block Magellan's Venom Demon with a wall of wax. He was able to give Luffy a Candle Champion set of gloves and boots in order to fight Magellan. He was able to fashion a key in order to free Ace during Marineford. And he was also able to aid in protecting Ace when Sengoku came in for his giant Buddha punch. In terms of ingenuity on Usopp's side, where do I begin, honestly? Because in a variety of situations throughout the entirety of the story, Usopp has been able to make junk into treasure and to be able to just pull out amazing feats of ingenuity from simple scraps in his bag, so much so that he was even able to fight one-on-one with Luffy and put on a very impressive show, even though he still ended up losing. In terms of surviving deadly events, Usopp and Mr. 3 are blood brothers in this, because there's a very interesting scene with Galdino in that when he reports to Mr. Zero, also known as Crocodile, that he failed, Mr. Zero, Crocodile, makes an example out of him in front of the entire cast of Baroque Works higher-ups and dehydrates him in front of all of them, and then feeds him to his pet Bananawana. It is found out later when Mr. Prince, also known as Sanji, comes to the rescue and kicks that same Bananawana in the gut, that Mr. 3 was actually safe the whole time as he preserved himself in a wax sphere. In that same arc, we get a very prominent example of Usopp's impressive endurance as he's able to survive a swing from a superhuman, also known as Babe, also known as Mr. 4, via using a 4-ton bat, hitting Usopp in the face. Usopp gets up like nothing has happened and continues to fight, even though the x-ray shot that we received shows that his skull was fractured in that hit. So yes, both Mr. 3 and Usopp can take a lot of punishment and still come out on top. I think when comparing Usopp and Galdino to one another, a very interesting topic in their designs is that they both wear goggles. What's very funny about this is that Mr. 3's goggles look like swimming goggles, which is very funny when you remember that he has seemingly met a watery end twice in the story, so that's kind of funny. But regardless, I think what's very interesting about Mr. 3 and Usopp is that Mr. 3, out of any Baroque Works agent, still has the 3 moniker in his design. He never lets it go, which I find very interesting. He's still holding on to this corporate work title that everyone else has very much readily abandoned. But no, Mr. 3 still has his hair in the shape of a 3. To me, this looks like an adult version of what Usopp goes through as Silky King. He holds on to that persona in order to give him strength in very compromising situations where his cowardice will otherwise get the better of him. But Mr. 3, being the adult, seems like the only time where he was successful was as a high-ranking Baroque Works agent. So maybe that's why he hangs on to this hairstyle that is in the shape of a 3, because he feels that he's sort of memorializing that point in his life in which he was the most useful to something greater other than himself. Very sad, but a very interesting take, which goes back to when I was talking about earlier, in that Mr. 3 feels like a very adult, very depressed version of Usopp. Because all the things Usopp displays, Mr. 3 also displays, but it seems to have a more sadder tint to it if you stop to think about it. Lastly, a very obvious comparison that's kind of interesting is that Little Garden, the arc in which Mr. 3 is the boss of, actually acts as our introduction to the giant race with Dory and Brocky. The giant race plays a very important part in Usopp's character because that really starts to instill in him what it means to be a warrior, and he takes that to heart and is the motivation for his character moving forward in the narrative. But yeah, I find that super interesting. He was the main antagonist at the time in which giants were formally introduced in the story, which is then what Usopp builds upon as character. So that's another very interesting comparison. This next comparison might throw you off for a loop, but Mr. 1, also known as Das Bones, and Franky have a lot of similarities. Let's go through them. Due to the powers of the Dice fruit, Mr. 1 has an iron body. Franky, being a cyborg, also has an iron body. Mr. 1 and Franky also have a devil fruit relationship. Let me explain. In SBS, it is said that if Franky were to eat a devil fruit, he would eat the arms fruit, which, as you may or may not know, is superior in the devil fruit hierarchy to Das Bones' fruit, known as the Dice fruit. Another interesting thing, devil fruits aside, is that both Mr. 1 and Franky are living weapons. Mr. 1, being the holder of the Dice fruit, is a living sword, whereas with Franky, he has a arsenal of weapons that take residence inside of his body. Another very interesting thing is that Franky, in his key design post-time skip, is sporting a shaved head. This is Mr. 1's design throughout the time that we've known him. Another interesting aspect in terms of design is that Mr. 1 dreams of being a superhero, and in a cover story of looking into the dreams of the various Baroque work agents, we see him don a mask and cape. Now, this is a play on his Japanese fruit name, which is called the Supa no Mi. So Supa is a play on the word superhero here. What does Franky always say? Super! There you go. Another very interesting thing going off of that is Franky is a bit of a nerd, as he, as well as many other people, love Sora, Knight of the Sea, the comic that the Marines put out, in which displays Germa 66. So he has an affinity for superheroes. Another interesting thing to build off of that is Franky, much like the superheroes in many Super Sentai shows, is the pilot of a giant robot. A giant robot made up of several individual vehicles. Well, 2, but you get it. So they are sort of conjoined in that way. Mr. 1 wants to be a superhero. Franky literally has superhero equipment in the form of a tank, a motorcycle, and he is the pilot of a giant robot. Now, Franky, I think, is one of those rare situations in which two aspects of his personality can be split between two characters. Sort of the mecha and sci-fi stuff can be represented in Mr. 1, as both of them are middlemen with a fascination of superheroes or have like superhero aesthetics. Because 2, there was an instance in which Mr. 1 dreamed to be a superhero, and that superhero getup looks like Franky's getup when we first are introduced to him, when he's wearing the mask and the star cape. So that's a very interesting comparison there. Both masks even have 3 prongs on them. But when you talk about sort of the trickster side of Franky, I believe that's represented in Cabaji, because Cabaji, like Franky, can use fire breath. Of course, Franky has fresh fire, whereas Cabaji has breath of death or blazing breath, as is translated in the Viz manga. So, another aspect is Cabaji has a unique form of transportation. He uses a unicycle. Franky has had various transformations that revolve around transportation, both in the pre and post time skip. In the pre time skip, he turned to a weird centaur man, and in the post time skip, he can turn his legs into tank treads. Another very interesting thing is that both of them use their bodies for storage. Cabaji is a sword swallower and usually uses his body as his own sword sheath, whereas Franky stores cola in the fridge inside his gut. So that's a very interesting aspect. Another thing, which this is a bit of a cop-out, but I thought was interesting, both of them use a weapon that is kind of thematic to their design, but is very rarely used. So with Franky, he uses an attack called Master Nail, in which he spits nails out of his mouth, whereas Cabaji uses an attack in which he throws tops on the ground. This attack is called Acrobatic Theater of 100 Kamikaze Tops. So, with Cabaji being a circus performer, that's thematic with him, and with Franky being a carpenter, a shipwright, nails, of course, are thematic with him because he's his own nail gun. So yeah, I thought that was very interesting between those two characters as well. Another interesting aspect that unites these three characters is that all three of them use swords, but aren't really true blue swordsmen. For example, Cabaji's fighting style is called carnival tricks, in which he incorporates carnival tricks with sword play. So there's a caveat there. It's not actual true sword play. Mr. One, despite being a sword after eating the dice fruit, does not consider himself a swordsman. And then we have Franky using Franky Shogun, who has a sword and uses a sword, but it's often played up as a gag just how bad he is at actual swordsmanship. Even there are attacks in which several crowds of people jump over his sword swings. So that's very funny, but very true across all three characters. Now, this may throw all of you for another loop, but I do think there is some parallels to be made for Alvida versus Nico Robin. Not so much so in terms of backstory, but in terms of how they worked in their respective organizations. Alvida was the co-captain and the main captain when Buggy was away and impaled down. So she was the de facto leader for a point in time of the Buggy Pirates. This parallels with Robin's position, not in the Straw Hat Pirates, but in Baroque Works, because she was the highest ranking female member and was only second to Crocodile himself. So she effectively was his co-captain in a way, if you pay attention to hierarchy. Now, in terms of abilities, we have some very interesting tracking going on here. Alvida has an ability that is localized to her body. Robin is the same. However, Alvida's ability just made her slimmer and untouchable, meaning that fists, bombs, bullets, and swords slip right past her. However, with Robin's ability, the flower fruit, it specifically blossoms duplicates of her body. So both fruits are localized to the body of the user. Another very interesting thing is that both Alvida and Robin do save their future respective captains, as there's a whole cover story about Alvida saving Buggy, and then during the first Crocodile fight, Robin does unearth Luffy after he loses to Crocodile. So that's a very interesting comparison there. Another very interesting comparison that's a bit surface level, but still interesting. Robin's Jolly Roger, even up into the post time skip, does display her wearing a cowboy hat. So the cowboy hat, even though she doesn't wear it in the events of the manga, is still a very prominent thing in her design, I guess you could say. Whereas Alvida, for the longest time, was denotated by wearing a cowboy hat. So that's very interesting. This will be the last of the canonical members we'll be talking about today, so we're going to compare Vivi and Mohji, and then Richie and Karoo. Okay? The first thing I would like to point out is that Mohji is Buggy's first mate. Don't know if that has changed, seeing as how the dynamic of his organization has changed drastically over the course of the narrative, but at least that's what it was when we left off with him before the Cross Guild formed. Okay? What's interesting about this is that Vivi could be considered Luffy's first mate or his vice captain. I've talked to a friend at length about this, and the thing is, Vivi brings a sense of diplomacy and level-headedness that Luffy actually adheres to that really hasn't been present on the crew since her absence. One could say if she was present during Water 7, the fight between Luffy and Usopp wouldn't have happened. And I'm willing to believe that because there is just a sense of matureness that she has that even now as a Yonko crew isn't really present on the crew. So I give those points to Vivi. Now, what's also very interesting with these two is that they both use very similar weapons. Mohji uses a whip, and Vivi's peacock slashers do resemble a whip. So there's that. Also, you can tell where they are in the story based on their appearance, because both Vivi and Mohji go through a myriad of hairstyles. Mohji goes through very funny hairstyles, obviously, but still, that could be said. Another very interesting thing when considering the animals of these two, Richie and Karoo, both Richie and Karoo have had leadership positions before. Richie was actually the standing captain of the Buggy Pirates at one point. This happens in a cover story. He beats up Cabaji and Mohji for the position. Very funny. Also, Karoo was the acting captain of his duck squadron back in Alabasta. So that's a very interesting aspect as well. And now, if you made it this far in the video, please show me the comparison between how the subscribe button looks when it's red and how it looks when it's gray. Show me the comparison of how the blue like button looks when it's gray and when it's blue. Tell a friend by clicking that share button. And thank you so much for watching this far. So at this point, we're going to cover some characters that haven't joined Cross Guild yet, but I think are very good contenders just based on some of the themes they present themselves with in the story and how they compare to some of the main characters in the Straw Hat crew currently. So there's going to be a lot of speculative talk here, but I hope you do follow from this point forward. So with that being said, moving on, based on her prominence in the story and her relation to Mihawk, as well as her prominence in other media, I do think she will join the Cross Guild at some point, and that character is Perona. Perona is very interesting because I think the character that she most parallels with is Nami. Nami even wore her shirt at the end of the bark. So that's interesting. She also was witness to Perona getting pawed away by Kuma when they were about to take the Straw Hat ship and run off with all of Moria's treasures. What's also very interesting about Perona and Nami is that they both have tattoos in remembrance of their fathers. And Nami, in Perona's case, it's their adoptive fathers. So Nami, of course, has the Mikan with the pinwheel in remembrance of Belmare and Gonzo, but Perona has a tattoo of a bat in remembrance of Gecko Moria, because Gecko Moria is more so represented by the bat than the gecko. He has like one gecko attack that he's used like one time, but his go-to weapon of choice for Doppelman to turn into literally is Brickbat. And then too, I don't even think he had a lizard zombie, but he did have a bat zombie. So I think it's the first zombie that we meet as well, which is very interesting. But moving on, also a very interesting tidbit about Nami and Perona is that where Nami has the log post on her arm all the time, what's interesting is that Perona has a watch. Why is a watch interesting? Based on how the One Piece world works, why would one need a watch when time zones perhaps fluctuate depending on each island you go to? You kind of see what I'm saying? A watch is very strange in One Piece because do time zones change depending where you're at in the world, like the real world? Or does it change from island to island? We don't know. But I find that very interesting that much like Nami, she too has a bit of jewelry on her wrist that may or may not be important. What's also very interesting is that she did guide Zoro back to Shaboti Archipelago. So she has acted as navigator before for somebody. I find that very interesting. Also, more so in the post-time skip, what's very interesting too is that Perona, much like Nami, can use familiars. Perona's hollow fruit has her generate familiars as a basic part of the ability. However, with Nami, when she got a hold of Zeus, she now too can summon a familiar at her beck and call to attack on her behalf. So that too is very interesting. Especially when you consider that Zeus and the Hollow Ghost basically attack in the same way. We see for the most part that the Hollow Ghost and Zeus prefer to go straight through the opponent, as they're both kind of ethereal beings. So that's another interesting aspect in the two familiars that these two women summon. Also, might I add, way back in the day, during the Arlong Park arc, there is a color spread of Nami wearing a watch before she got the log post. So that's also very interesting. Another character that I think may join Cross Guild just based on his proximity to Perona and how much he comes up during Perona's stead with Dracula Mihawk is Moria. Moria, I feel, really does compare to Brook in a number of ways. One being which that Brook had to leave his crew behind, allowing them all to die because they were in a very powerless situation, and now he wanders the earth as a skeletal abomination. So, in order to complete that dream of returning the sound of their last song to Laboon, he has to carry this weight. What's so interesting about this is that Moria is very comparable to Brook in that way, because I think the main theme of Thriller Bark as a whole is just loss. Because as we know, Moria got his crew decimated by Kaido, and now that has really messed him up internally, and he can only place trust in his own abominations, the ones he creates via the use of his shadow fruit, which we know are zombies. So that's very interesting, especially when how this theme of loss continues in the post-time skip, and how he now has lost Absalom as well, one of the few people that were part of his crew that were living beings. So that's just sad overall. What's also very interesting too is in terms of power usage, both of them have this weird ethereal stand-like ability, because in the post-time skip we find out that Brook has the power of astral projection. It can actually allow his soul to leave his body and linger for an undetermined distance. Doppelman is the same thing, as he is Moria's shadow, the main weapon of the shadow fruit, and he too basically is his own being that's a very ethereal, ghostly entity that can take the shape of any form of matter. He could be a gas, he could be a liquid, or a solid. So that's very interesting. Another interesting aspect about Brook's abilities is that when he starts a jam session in the post-time skip, and you see this a lot in Whole Cake, a giant ethereal skeleton will just come out of him, and it looks kind of like a stand from JoJo's. I don't know what that is, but it seems to be an extension of his music and his soul together, as it's able to affect a myriad of homies and just exorcise them immediately. So there's that, which is very comparable to Doppelman, because again, it's a projection of him. Doppelman looks like Moria, and this Soul King projection looks like Brook. So that's how they compare to each other as well. What's also very interesting about their abilities in general is that during Thriller Bark is the most important time for One Piece in terms of devil fruits, because really Brook and Moria together changed the game of what devil fruits can actually be. I guess you could put Perona in that too, because she's weird as well. Because before them, devil fruits were kind of very bare bones and standard. You had Buggy and Luffy and Apoo, these things that are very easy to understand with not too many systems going on with them. With Brook, just in the situation that he finds himself in is very complicated. He's a skeleton that can eat, that can poop. He's immune to lightning, but he's not immune to fire. He is not immune to gas. He can hear things, yet he has no ears. He can see things, yet he has no eyes, etc., etc., etc. The whole skull joke bit. But it's just a very interesting myriad of systems, especially when, too, he has cryokinesis in the post-time skip because of his soul abilities, apparently. All very weird. And then, too, when you see Moria, even though shadows aren't technically souls, souls are souls, and that distinction is made clear with Brook and later with Big Mom. But still, the fact that shadows can do all of what they can do in One Piece is just very strange. And it's very powerful because if you don't have a shadow, you can just be deleted by the sun, which is interesting. And before this introduction of these two fruits, devil fruits weren't that extreme. There weren't hard rules attached to the natural laws of the world that gave people these allowances or immunities. You kind of see what I'm saying? Or afflicted these absolute truths onto others. Like the whole shadowless thing is an absolute truth of the One Piece world. If you don't have a shadow, you just die in the sun. Crazy. And then with Brook, he returned from the afterlife as a soul to find his body. So that's the first time a devil fruit has extended upon the realm of death. Very weird, very interesting. But yes, they put the weird powers on the map. And that's why, too, the Thriller Bark arc is just one of the most important arcs in One Piece. And then, of course, Perona is the first time that we see devil fruit actually generate familiars. Also very interesting, very interesting. But yes, that arc with those two especially are two of the most important devil fruits in the series because it really sets the tone for the remainder of the series. What's also very interesting about this too is that both of these characters have roots in the same point of inspiration. What I mean by this is that both of them are based off of characters from the film Nightmare Before Christmas. Nightmare Before Christmas, of course, is about Jack Skellington, the leader of the holiday Halloween. He's the Santa Claus equivalent to Halloween. He is a tall skeleton figure with, it's implied, some abilities. It's not very well defined, but okay, he has abilities, I guess. And he's a very musical skeleton because Nightmare Before Christmas is a musical. So that's the inspiration of Brook, a tall skeleton who is very musical. Now, the inspiration for Moria is actually Oogie Boogie. Oogie Boogie is the antagonist of Nightmare Before Christmas. He is a sentient burlap sack filled with bugs, and the consensus is that there is a leader bug within his burlap body that controls all the other bugs. At least that's what is implied from the film. What's also implied in the film and later displayed in other media, which we'll get to in a second, is that Oogie Boogie has shadow powers, because in the intro of the film, Oogie Boogie's line is, "I am the shadow on the moon at night, filling your dreams to the brim with fright." And we see his face as a shadow on the moon. That shadow then disperses into bats, which of course is what Doppelman is known for doing. He is a shadow possessed by Moria who can disperse into bats. Another very interesting thing is that there was a video game for Nightmare Before Christmas that came out on the Xbox and the PlayStation 2. And if this was released in Japan and the US during October of 2005. So, in this video game, Nightmare Before Christmas, Oogie Boogie's Revenge, Jack gets a weird, almost putty-like substance fused to his wrist called the Soul Robber, and it is a green, gooey-like whip that can transform into a variety of weapons. This is very similar to how Brook has the ability to astral project, and his soul becomes a green ghost that is then tethered to his skeletal body. Another interesting thing about this video game and the film that it is based off of is that Oogie Boogie's shadow powers extend past the intro song. In a song about Oogie Boogie that the trick-or-treaters sing about, it is implied that Oogie Boogie's shadow is sentient because we see it moving throughout the film as the trick-or-treaters sing about Oogie Boogie. This is expanded upon in the video game, in which Oogie Boogie's shadow represents several boss fights throughout the video game. His shadow as an entity on its own. He even says, "Oh, you're not even fighting me. This is the shadow. I'm the shadow of Oogie Boogie." So that is a very similar theme to Moria's powers. As you know, he and Doppelman can switch places on the spot. And for context, just to let you know about the time placement of things, the Thriller Bark arc in the manga extends from 2007 to 2008. 2 years after the release of this video game. So I just find that all super duper interesting, especially when the final boss fight of said video game has Oogie Boogie transform into a giant version of himself. As you may remember, Moria did the same thing at the end of Thriller Bark, where he ate all the shadows that were possessing all the zombies on the island and turned into his Shadow Asgard state. Another thing that unites Brook and Moria is their unique sort of second-hand swordsmanship usage. Because Brook, even though he has a lot of lore attached with him being a swordsman, I really wouldn't consider him a true blue swordsman because he's a musician. And a lot of his strength really lies in his power of music. Same thing with Moria, even though he has his scissor blades, which can detach and become dual-wielding blades. Those are usually used just to sever the shadow from a victim in order to make a zombie or power himself up. So he uses swords, but isn't really a swordsman. Brook is more of a swordsman, but especially after the post-time skip happens, I would strongly consider him more of a musician. Even in the pre-time skip where he hypnotizes the flying fish riders and makes them fall asleep, I would still say that was an expression of his Doflamingo coming into play because his soul is connected to his music, and it's been shown he can use his music as a medium to inflict or impress his soul onto others. So that's a thing. Also, too, even though he can express like weird soul-generated cryokinesis ice through his sword, that's still a Doflamingo thing, if you get my meaning. Another interesting thing about these two is that they are sort of the real expression of the presumable swordsmen on their respective crews. So for Brook, of course, he's a Straw Hat. Brook is the crew member of Zoro. Zoro has always been likened to a demon, a ethereal swordsman with the powers of hell at his disposal, whereas Brook literally is that. He literally is an otherworldly being that has been likened to Satan at one point, and he now apparently can bring ice from the underworld and use that in his attacks. I don't know how real that is, but seeing as how he literally comes from the spirit world via the use of his Doflamingo and is now inhabiting his body, which has been decomposed, I really wouldn't put it past him. And then, of course, we have Dracula Mihawk, who is named Dracula and looks like a vampire, but he very much is just a really strong, normal dude. Whereas Moria has a very classic, almost cartoon vampire-like appearance and has an ability that will make people die in the sun, which is a classical weakness of a vampire. They can't survive in the sun. Also, thanks to the powers of the Shadow Fruit too, an aspect of him can literally transform into bats, which is another classic vampire ability, to become bats or a bat. So yeah, there's that. So I just find that interesting that these two are literally the expressions of the metaphorical display of the actual swordsman that they are associated with. Now, much like how with Franky and how I compare the two aspects of his character being broken down to two different characters, I think we can say the same for Brook. You see, there are a lot of comparisons between Brook and Moria. However, unfortunately, Moria is in no way a musician. The one musician that I could see being that aspect for Brook, being that representation for Brook in Cross Guild, is potentially Apoo because he does fit things thematically. Also, another thing that's interesting about Apoo as well, as you know, during the post-time skip, Brook's managers were members of the Long Arm tribe. Apoo is our first member from that tribe in the narrative. Therefore, I think he most likely is the most important member of the tribe in the narrative, bar none. Also, what's very interesting about Apoo is that he does introduce us in a way to the concept of Cross Guild because he's the one who starts handing out all the bounty posters. So he most likely told Kid-in-Law about Buggy starting up the Cross Guild. Another interesting aspect when it comes to Brook and Apoo is their design. There's a theme of simple versus complex and new school versus old school going on here. When we first see Brook, he is dressed more akin to a classical musician, and he plays classical instruments. In his backstory, we see him playing a violin and a piano, and then in the present day, during the pre-time skip, he is playing a violin and a piano. Then in the post-time skip, he's more so a bit updated because he looks more like a 70s, 80s rocker, and he depends on his guitar for most of his music. Then with Apoo, it's not really clear what genre of music he's a part of, but in the post-time skip, when he's working on Kaido, it's very obvious that he's more akin to a rapper and a DJ because we see him during the whole party at Onigashima. Now, in terms of abilities, Brook is a bit more complex, a bit more esoteric, because his music attacks the soul. It's not so much you hearing the music, it's you being in Brook's presence and him playing the music. And the music attaches to the soul of a living being rather than attaching to the aspect of them hearing the music. However, on the flip, Apoo is strictly about you hearing the music. In order for his attacks to work, a target needs to hear the sound that he plays. Otherwise, the slashing or the explosion effects that go in accordance with his attack won't actually pop off. So I find that very funny that such a destructive ability has such a glaring weakness. So what's also funny about this is that one opposes the other because Brook would be able to affect Apoo, but technically Apoo would most likely not be able to affect Brook because, of course, Brook has no ears. Yo ho ho, skull joke. But yeah, very interesting indeed. Now, what would be funny and interesting is that if Apoo is presented with the option to join Cross Guild, or he seeks Cross Guild out to join them, that he would offer up NB as a bargaining chip. NB was the number one number working for Kaido. He was an ancient giant. So it would be very interesting to see if he used NB as a bargaining chip to get him into Cross Guild, because apparently having giants working for you is a big deal, and I guess we'll find out more about giants in general in Elbaf. But as you know too, Buggy lost the new giant pirates as they joined the Straw Hat Fleet. So it'd be very cool that not only are they getting a giant, they're getting an ancient giant, as you know, is bigger than a regular giant. So that'd be really cool. And it'd be interesting if Moria too joins Cross Guild, so then Moria will be in the presence of yet another ancient giant, which makes for number 3. I don't know what will come from that, but the antics are sure to be great. Mr. 2, Mr. 2 Bonkudi, or Bon Clay, or just simply Betham, is comparable to Tony, Chomper of the Straw Hats. Another character in this trifecta who I think is comparable to Chomper is the resident of the Island of Rare Animals, also known as Gaimon. So, in this breakdown, we're going to talk about how Bon Clay and Gaimon kind of have some similarities to Chomper, or at least some story beats that are very similar to Chomper. So, let's talk about Mr. 2 first. Mr. 2 uses the power of transformation in his fighting style, mostly for defense, however, as his Okama Kenpo seemingly only works with his body proportions. So this parallels to Chomper because Chomper uses the power of transformation for both offensive and defensive purposes. As the form that he chooses to stay in most of the time, his hybrid state has no offensive capabilities whatsoever as far as we've seen. So that's a comparison between the two. One uses their transformative abilities simply for defense and espionage sometimes, and the other uses his transformative abilities for attack and defense. Another interesting thing between these two is that you kind of get a weird inside baseball aspect of Bon Clay's abilities when you really start to think about it, because Bon Clay was actually able to copy Chomper in his hybrid state. I don't know if he can copy all animals, or was Chomper just the exception because Chomper is like weirdly technically also a human because he's a reindeer that ate the human fruit, and he was in a hybrid state, so he was human at the time, you could say. I think that could be what's going on, but it's a very interesting thing to think about. Another interesting thing when it comes to Mr. 2 is that he does know Mr. 3 based on that whole Baroque Works cover story, and it's very funny that he was originally tasked to kill him, so it's quite interesting that they sort of were working together in order to free the rest of the other Baroque Works agents that are being held in prison. But we also see him again in Impel Down, so by that time he does know Buggy and Mr. 3. And, we have the touching sacrifice after the end of that arc where he seemingly sacrifices himself so the others can escape. But we later find out in chapter 666, we find out that he is now the new leader of level 5.5. We don't see his face, but I kind of wanted to touch on that for a second. Even though he seemingly is in his default state, we do know that he can swap out characteristics while keeping his same body proportions, because we see this in the Sanji fight where he pulls off the funniest face in the world technique, combining aspects of his own face with those of Usopp's. But what's also very interesting, and I don't know if this is going to mean anything in the future, but I really want to bring this up. We know that he's infamous for copying Nami, right? In the video game, One Piece Burning Blood, which is a fighting game, he has a costume in which he is Nami. What's interesting about this costume is that it's not the Nami that we see during Impel Down or Alabasta. It's Nami with his body proportions. So it's a 7'10" tall Nami using Okama Kenpo. I just find that really interesting because this is the only place where this combination of things exists. And it's weirdly canonically friendly because this sort of transformation is possible. Because like I just said, he's able to conjoin different aspects of people with his own body proportions. So a 7-foot tall Nami is a possibility for Betham if things were to be changed up for him in the future, reflecting his whole deformity possibly after fighting Magellan. Don't know how that's going to pan out, but we'll see. Another interesting aspect that really parallels with him and Chomper is that both of them get their dreams absolutely crushed because both of them meet their heroes and their heroes don't turn out how they thought they would be. For example, Chomper meets Dr. Hallback on Thriller Bark. Dr. Hallback is the greatest surgeon in the world. However, Chomper finds out that he is a monster. He is a serial grave robber and a monster, possibly a pervert, but a monster, okay? And then Betham, Mr. 2, finds out that Ivankov, this super duper miracle worker, is actually kind of a very morally gray, almost villainous individual because he only kind of does things when it benefits him or goes along with his agenda. So his sort of aspects in the narrative are just kind of questionable, and Mr. 2 is kind of weirdly put off by him and doesn't know what to make of him after experiencing how he actually is. So that's how the two compare to one another there. So when comparing Chomper to Gaimon, there are some very interesting things to point out. Number one, both of them are very small guys. That's the obvious thing. However, number two, both of them have like a weird relation to mountains or peaks, and they're backstory. So number one, Gaimon wants to know if the treasure on one of the peaks on the island of rare animals is still there. It turns out it's not. So therefore, his island peak, his island mountain is associated with despair and acceptance. However, when you get to Drum Island, Chomper takes residence on one of the mountaintops of Drum Island, and also during the end, these mountaintops are turned to giant sakura trees. So you can say Chomper's island peaks are representative of hope and health because, of course, sakura blossoms are associated with a cure-all in Dr. Hirolock's explanation to Chomper. So that's a interesting aspect there. Another very interesting thing is that Chomper is a rare animal, which is funny because Gaimon lives on the island of rare animals. And what's interesting about the very freaky chimeras that take residence on the island of rare animals and Chomper himself is that they are very interesting and unique animal types in the world of One Piece, because no matter how far we have gone away from Chomper as a concept or the island of rare animals in the East Blue, nothing else in the One Piece world is quite like these two types, because nothing in the One Piece world looks exactly like Chomper. We have things that are close, like the minks of Zou, but nothing quite matches Chomper. Then, with the island of rare animals, chimeras don't exist anywhere else in the One Piece world. Naturally occurring chimeras that aren't under the influence of a dough fruit simply do not exist anywhere but the island of rare animals. Not even Maraview, the subject of Strong World, which actually does exist in the world of One Piece, that contains super strong normal animals, not chimeras. The island of rare animals is specifically the only place where chimeras exist. So, both of them are associated with being unique animals. Gaimon being the resident of the island of rare animals, and Chomper being a rare animal himself. Also, I'd like to point out that obviously Mr. 2 and Gaimon both know Buggy, because after Luffy defeats Buggy, he does meet up with Gaimon. And the two strike up a friendship after a quarrel, and then he sails off and he gets in trouble with a giant crab and meets Alvida. So yes, both Mr. 2 and Gaimon know Buggy. One a little better than the other, but still. So this may throw people for a loop, but you know who could be a foil to Jinbe? Don Quixote Doflamingo. Because here's the thing, okay? Jinbe's sun branding, the sun mark, which is the replacement for the celestial dragon mark, right? You know who is a celestial dragon, or at least a former celestial dragon? Doflamingo. So one ran a slave operation in which they were selling people of all different races. That was Doflamingo's operation in Cabaji, right? Well, we know that Fisher Tiger, and by extension Jinbe, is very, very, very opposed to slavery. So there's that. Another thing, even though I have my reservations about this, and that will be in another long video much like this one here, but Jinbe is the helmsman of the Straw Hat Pirates. He controls the ship. A theme of control is also present with Doflamingo, because throughout Dressrosa, Doflamingo is both figuratively and literally a puppet master. One of his most famous abilities is called Parasite, in which he controls people like puppets. So you kind of got a steering theme there, kinda. If you want a more literal interpretation, actually Jinbe is the only Straw Hat that has an ability that controls other beings. You know that whole fish call that he does that's really kind of almost exclusively a merfolk ability? He's the only fishman in the series so far that can do that. So he calls on fish and asks them to do his bidding. No other Straw Hat has an ability like that. The closest thing is sort of Nami and Zeus' relationship, but that's the thing, it's a relationship. So that's really kind of weird on Jinbe's part, that he actually commands living beings to do his bidding. That may be a real dark way to look at it, but that's a very similar thing to what Doflamingo does with Parasite. He controls living beings to do his bidding. So one is a more eco-friendly version of the same thing. Another interesting thing is that Doflamingo experience both worlds of extreme opulence and poverty, where kind of really Jinbe, despite his morals being instilled by the people around him, has never experienced actual hardship as far as we know. So it's very interesting that someone from the height of affluency experienced the dregs of society, and then we have someone who is endeared by the dregs of society and the injustice in that society, only to have never really experienced those hardships himself. So I find that very interesting about Jinbe and Doflamingo. This could also work for Koala, because you know we're Koala conspiracy boys around here. So Koala actually was a slave, and too has the mark of the Son of Pirates, which was branded over the mark of the Celestial Dragons. So Koala too would fall into this sort of dynamic with Doflamingo, and she appears formally as an adult in Dressrosa, which is Doflamingo's arc. And with that, that has been my 1-year anniversary video. It has been a great year on YouTube. I have been very blessed to have so many great subscribers. Thank you all for liking and subscribing. Continue to like and subscribe. Tell a friend, share all the videos that you come across with me on them. I want to give a special thanks to Blumph for the 2 Cross Guild Connection streams I was on. Also, a shout out to Din Din Cushy for letting me know about those 2 streams. Shout out to Kev, who was also on those streams. Shout out to Eli DZ, who has also been a great dude through all this. Shout out to C Stone Sage. I'm still going to do that bubble video because it was a very interesting idea. Shout out to Tachi Spins, who has also been a great dude throughout this entire thing, and he has a lot of great ideas. Congrats, bruh, on the recent monetization. Also, congrats again to Eli DZ for the recent monetization. Shout out to all my fellows on my Discord, the Digital Burrow. You all come up with some great ideas, especially KMDP, Minnie. Shout out to fellow content creator Adam Genrikai, who makes a very good comic called The Shonen Beat. Check it out on his Patreon. And also fellow content creator Reddit Sephiroth. He does a lot of wrestling content. He's faithfully here on YouTube every Wednesday after the show. So go check him out, give him some love. Also fellow content creator Young Usopp. He makes a lot of cool music videos. Big ups, bruh. So yes, thank you all. Thank you to anyone who has supported me throughout this year. Sorry if I didn't mention you by name, so thank you all. I appreciate all of you. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Thank you again. Thank you again so much for watching. If you like stuff like this, please feel free to check out my YouTube channel, Pauly P Works. And if you like what you see, I would appreciate your subscription. Thank you so much.